The first thing Neril Voss would remember about the fall of Titan was how quiet the humans were while they lost. He was a rememberer third rank, and his duty aboard the flagship Undimmed was simple. He watched and he wrote. He had recorded 11 conquests before this one, and every one of them had sounded the same in its final hour. There was always screaming on the enemy channels, always the babble of a species, discovering too late what the Sethari Ascendancy was pleading, bargaining. The particular high sound a captain made when he understood his ship was already dead, and his mouth had not caught up. Titan did not sound like that. Titan sounded like people at work. Neril sat at his recording alcove, 6 talons resting on the cold interface, and he listened to a human fleet die with something close to boredom in their voices. Short words. Coordinates. A woman somewhere out in the smoke saying a name twice. Waiting. Then, moving on to the next name. The moon called Titan burned orange below them, and the last human warships came apart under the guns of the Undimmed, one after another, and none of the humans wept. Then, on a channel that was breaking up, as its ship broke up, a calm voice cut through. A man, almost gentle. All stations, start the clock. Neril wrote it down. He did not know why. It meant nothing. A dying order. A piece of dead ritual from a beaten people. He assumed it was a distress timer, some countdown to rescue that would never come. He noted the time and the phrase, and moved on. On the command deck above him, Sky-Marshal Duran Kale heard it too, and laughed, and said the thing he had said over 11 worlds. Close the record, that was the whole of it. 2 orders, spoken across the same burning moon, and no one on the Undimmed understood that only one of them belonged to the winning side. For a long time afterward, Neril would think about that hour, about how certain they had all been, about how a species can hand you the exact shape of your own ending, and you will file it, calmly, under victory. The Ascendancy did not merely win at Titan, it performed the winning. Within the day, Kale ordered the record of the battle cut and dressed and broadcast on every open band the Ascendancy held. And the Ascendancy held a great many. 40 species watched it. 40 tributary peoples, client worlds and cowed neighbors saw the footage. The Ascendancy wanted them to see under a single line of text in the trade tongue that every one of them could read. Humanity's greatest defeat. It was good footage. Neril had helped cut it, and he was proud of the work in the way a craftsman is proud, without thinking too hard about the thing the craft was for. There was the human fleet, brave and small. There were the shipworks of Titan, the enormous scaffolds where the humans built their vessels going dark, one gantry at a time. There was the surrender. That was not quite a surrender. The fleet falling silent, rather than yielding, which the editors framed as terror. And there, near the end, was the face. The Ascendancy always kept a face. It was doctrine. A conquered people would forget a number, but they would not forget a face. And a face taken and paraded was worth more than any burned city. So when Kale's boarding crews took the Titan shipworks, they took prisoners for the broadcast. And the one the editors chose was a woman named Dana Okafor. Neril knew her name because it was his job to know it. He had her file open in front of him. Now, human female, 38 years of her people's years, a shipwright, a yard supervisor. Whatever a supervisor meant to a species that built by the 1,000, 2 children ages he had recorded and could not stop looking at. In the footage, she was not screaming either. That was the strange thing, the thing the editors had trouble with. She stood in the smoke of her own yard, and she was directing an evacuation, sending others up the lifting cages ahead of her, checking each one. Calm as a woman counting stock, she was still counting when the boarding crew reached her. She looked into their weapons, the way you look at bad weather. Then, she went where they pushed her. The editors cut the calm out. It did not fit the story. In the broadcast, Dana Okafor's face was frozen on a single frame that could be read as fear, and the line beneath it said what the Ascendancy needed it to say. And 40 species believed. Neril kept the uncut version. He told himself it was for the archive. Rememberers were allowed that much. Up on the deck, the mood was wine and certainty. Kale stood before the great window with the burned moon reflected in his eyes, and made the report that would go back to the Ascendancy's High Council, And Neril recorded that too. "The human navy is ended," Kale said. "We destroyed 40 hulls at Titan. 40. That was the whole of what this species could put in the black, and it is ash. Now, their yards are ours. Their moon is ours. There is nothing left of them that can be called a fleet. 40 hulls. Neril wrote it into the permanent record, and beside it, because he was thorough, he wrote what 40 hulls meant. It meant humanity was a small people who had built a small navy and lost it. It meant the war was a footnote. It meant the thing was done. He believed it. Everyone aboard the Undimmed believed it. The belief was so total that no one thought to question it. And that was the belief the next months would take apart one calm human sentence at a time. The Sethari had a saying old, as the Ascendancy itself carved over the door of the War College, where Kyle had trained, "A people is its fleet. Break the fleet, and you break the people." It had been true 40 times. It was the whole of their science of war. They measured a species by the ships it could field today, and they had never once thought to measure the thing a species could field tomorrow. Neril did not know that a great distance away in a room, the Ascendancy could not see. Other humans were not mourning Titan at all. He would learn the shape of that room only later from the records. The humans themselves would hand him, which is its own kind of horror. But this is what was in it. A long table, a wall covered in the debris analysis from Titan, every fragment of every Sethari ship that had fired on that moon, catalogued and cross-sectioned and understood. A calm woman named Mara Holt, standing at the head of it, an admiral of a fleet the Ascendancy did not believe existed, saying almost nothing. And in the corner of that room, a plain digital counter, ticking upward, not down, up. Someone in that room in the hour Titan fell had said the same words the dying man had said. "Start the clock." And in that room it had not meant rescue. It had meant something the Sethari had no word for, which is perhaps why they never saw it coming. None of that reached Neril yet. What reached him in the days after Titan was only a small wrongness. He could not name the kind a rememberer feels before he can prove it. He noticed it going back through the enemy channels for the archive. The humans of Titan had lost, that was not in doubt, but they had not begged. Across 11 conquests, he had heard every note a losing species could make, and humanity had made none of them. No surrender, broadcast, no bargaining, no captain's high cry. In the last minute on the last open band before the shipworks went fully dark, a human controller had transmitted a single string of numbers to no one, and then the channel had gone quiet on purpose. Neril played it back, just numbers flat, an unhurried a woman, reading them like a recipe. He ran them against every code the Ascendancy held, and found nothing, not a distress key, not a self-destruct sequence, not a print error. He told himself it was noise, a dying reflex. He almost deleted it. Instead, being what he was, he wrote it into the record, and he closed the file. And he tried not to think about how a beaten people had spent their last breath, not screaming, but counting. The Ascendancy did what the Ascendancy always did with a beaten world. It settled in. Kale's fleet spread out along the outer edge of the human system, the place the humans called Sol, and began the slow work of occupation. Patrol routes were drawn, watch schedules were fixed, tribute assessors were sent inward toward the small blue planet to determine what the conquered had that was worth taking. It was routine. That was the word that ran through every order that came down to Neril's alcove. In those weeks, routine patrol density, routine sweep, routine hold. The Sethari had conquered 40 peoples, and the 40th was meant to feel like the 39th. For a while, it did. Then the small wrongnesses began, and Neril, whose whole function was to notice and to write, began to notice more than he wanted. The first was the yard. The Titan shipworks were supposed to be dead. Kale's crews had gutted them, taken the tools they understood, and slagged the tools they did not, and marked the whole complex as a conquered asset, awaiting demolition. Neril had the report in the permanent record. Titan shipworks capacity destroyed. And yet a survey drone, 3 weeks after the battle, brought back an image of one of the deep gantries with heat bleeding off it. Not fire, working heat. the steady warmth of a place where something was being made. Neril flagged it up the chain, as was his duty. The answer came back down from the command deck in Kale's own phrasing, and it was the phrasing that stayed with him. A scavenger fire. Nothing is being built on a dead moon. The record is closed. The record is closed. Neril wrote the order down. It was the second time he had heard the Sky-Marshal say it, and it landed a little differently than it had over the burning moon. The first time it had been a boast. This time it was an answer to a question, and it did not actually answer the question. A dead moon does not hold working heat for 3 weeks. Neril knew that, Kale knew that, but the record was closed, and so it was closed, and the drone image went into a file that no one would open until it was far too late to matter. He kept a copy. He was starting to keep a great many copies. The second wrongness was in the mail. Part of the occupation was listening. The Ascendancy intercepted everything the humans sent, every transmission between the small planet and its scattered outposts, and passed the take to rememberers like Neril, to be logged, and where possible understood. Most of it was mundane. Supply manifests, family messages, the endless small talk of a species that talked constant. Neril read it, the way you read the sky of a world you have conquered, expecting nothing. But the tone was wrong. He had catalogued the correspondence of 11 fallen peoples, and a fallen people wrote in a certain way. There was grief in it, and fear, and the small mean quarrels of the newly poor. There was above all the sound of an ending of a species turning to look back at what it had been. Humanity was not writing like that. Humanity was writing like a people, in the middle of a project. The messages Neril logged were full of dates, not memorials. Deadlines. He read a transmission from an outpost. He could not locate to another. He could not locate a technical exchange. He could barely parse and buried in. It was a line. A human had written without any idea an enemy would ever read it. On schedule. Ahead. On the second batch. Tell them the clock's holding the clock. There it was again. The word the dying man had used over Titan. Neril pulled the recording of that Latin cower, cat a cat of catter, and played the flat woman's numbers once more, and for the first time it occurred to him coldly that a countdown runs down and a clock runs up, and that he had never actually established which of the two he was listening to. He did not report the thought. He had nothing to report but a feeling, and a rememberer does not write feelings into the permanent record. Far inward on the world, the Sethari had already priced and catalogued. The humans were doing the thing Neril could feel and not see. They were not mourning Titan. This is the part the Ascendancy would never have believed, even shown proof, because it ran against the one thing they were sure of. The humans had taken the loss of 40 ships and turned it within days into a curriculum. Every scrap of every Sethari vessel that had fired on Titan, every fragment Kale's own guns had left. Drifting, the humans had gathered and hauled home and laid out on long tables and taken apart, not to mourn it, to read it. They wanted to know exactly how the Undimmed and her sisters had done what they did, down to the metallurgy, down to the firing logic. And they wanted to know it because they had every intention of doing it back, only better. In the room the Ascendancy could not see. The plane counter went on ticking upward, and Mara Holt stood at the wall of Titan debris and looked at it the way a student looks at an exam. She has already decided to pass, and in the holding decks of the Undimmed, Dana Okafor was doing her own quiet work. She was a prisoner, along with a few dozen others taken from the yards, kept for the value the Ascendancy placed on faces. She should, by Sethari doctrine, have been broken by now. A conquered creature paraded before 40 species cut off from her world, and her children was supposed to fold. That was the whole point of taking her. She had not folded. Neril watched her on the holding deck feeds because he was the one who kept the file, and he saw a woman who counted. She counted the others every morning, the way she had counted the evacuation cages in the smoke, making sure the number was whole. She learned the guards' rotation and taught it to the frightened ones, so they would know when they could rest. She kept a tally of the days scratched into the wall of her cell, small marks patient, adding up towards something only she could see. When a young prisoner wept, she did not tell him it would be all right. She told him to keep his hands busy and his count straight, and somehow that was better. Neril found that he did not want to broadcast her anymore. He told himself it was because the footage was stale, It was not because of that. The third wrongness ended the pretense of routine. A Sethari patrol, 3 ships ran a standard sweep along the near edge of the human system, past the outer stations. The humans still inexplicably operated. It was a nothing assignment, routine patrol density, the order had said. The 3 ships checked in on schedule at the edge of the sweep. Then they did not check in at the far end. There was no distress call. That was what Neril could not get past later when he wrote it up. Across 11 conquests, he had catalogued many kinds of loss, and loss made noise. A ship dying screamed on every band and every code, because dying things reach out. These 3 had not reached out. They had simply stopped being at the place they were supposed to be between one check and the next. And there was no wreckage, and no signal, and no trace of what had touched them. Kale demanded an explanation. Neril was ordered to find the ships in the record, to produce their fate to close the matter. He searched everything. The Ascendancy held. He ran the sensor take from the neighboring patrols. He looked for the enemy vessel that must have done this, some hidden human warship, and he built the profile of it from the little the data allowed. And then he ran that profile against the Ascendancy's entire archive of known ships. Every hull of every species the Sethari had ever recorded in 12,000 years of conquest. He found nothing. He ran it again wider against the histories, against the wrecks, against the myths. Nothing. Neril sat very still in his alcove, with the empty result in front of him. 3 ships gone, without a sound, taken by something that left no mark and matched no record the Ascendancy had ever kept. He thought about the working heat on the dead moon. He thought about the mail full of deadlines. He thought about a beaten people, spending their last breath, counting instead of screaming, and a clock that he had assumed ran down. When he made his report to the command deck, he chose his words the way a rememberer does carefully, because words go into the permanent record forever. He said that he could not identify the vessel responsible, he said, and he made himself say it plainly, that whatever had taken the patrol was not in the Ascendancy's records, not in any archive, not anywhere the Sethari had ever looked. There was a silence on the command channel. Then Kael's voice came down flatter than before, with the first thin thread of something underneath it, that Neril, who studied voices, recognized and did not name. Then it is nothing, the Sky-Marshal said. A malfunction. A navigation error. Log and move on. The record is closed. Neril logged it. He did not believe it. And this time, when he saved his own private copy, his talons were not quite steady on the cold interface, because a rememberer knows the difference between a record that is closed and a record that has only just begun to write itself. Kael's answer to a thing he could not explain was to make a spectacle of strength, because that was the only tool the Ascendancy had ever needed. If 3 ships had vanished, then the humans, somehow against all record, had teeth left. The correct response by Sethari doctrine was to pull those teeth in front of an audience, a conquered people who saw one of their own outposts, erased for the crime of resistance, would remember the lesson in their bones. Kael had done it 11 times. It always worked. Fear was a language. Every species spoke, and the Ascendancy was fluent. He chose one of the human outer stations, a drifting thing of rings, and lit windows near the edge of Sol, and he sent a punishment squadron to break it while the rest of the humans watched. He had it broadcast, of course. He wanted 40 species to see it, and he wanted the humans to see it most of all. Neril was ordered to record. The squadron arrived. It ranged its guns. It transmitted the demand for surrender that no one was meant to accept, so that the refusal could justify the lesson, and the humans did not react. That was the thing Neril could not fit into the record. He had watched 11 peoples meet the punishment squadron, and every one of them had done something. Panicked, scrambled defenses, bailed on open channels, fled. The reaction was the point. The reaction was the fear, and the fear was the victory. The human station simply kept its lights on. It answered the surrender demand with a single transmission, unhurried, a controller's voice with no strain in it at all, and the transmission was not a plea. It was a correction. The controller told the Sethari squadron politely the exact range at which their lead ship was currently sitting, and observed that it was closer than the squadron commander probably intended, and suggested he check his own instruments. The squadron commander checked his instruments. He was closer than he intended. What happened next, Neril recorded, and could barely follow while it happened, and understood only afterward, when he took it apart, frame by frame. The human station was not defenseless. It had never been defenseless. It had simply been quiet, the way the whole species was quiet, holding still until stillness stopped being useful. When the punishment squadron finally fired, the station was already not where its guns were aimed, and the human weapons that answered did not look like human weapons at all. They looked like Sethari weapons. Neril saw it and felt the floor of his certainty tilt. The firing signatures coming off that station, the beam logic, the targeting cadence were the Ascendancy's own. They were the signatures from Titan. The humans had taken the way Kale's ships killed their fleet, and in the weeks since they had built it and improved it, and they were using it now to take Kale's squadron apart with a kind of dreadful courtesy, disabling, rather than destroying, leaving the crews alive to carry the story home. The punishment squadron limped back. It had gone to teach a lesson. It had been the lesson. On the command deck, the wine was gone. Kale stood at the great window and demanded numbers, and it fell to Neril to give them. And the numbers were the second, reveal the one that took 40 and made it a lie. Because in reading, the sensor take from the station and trying to understand how a dead people had a working shipyard's worth of firepower on one drifting ring, Neril had swept wider than the fight, and he had counted what the sweep found. Not one station, not one hidden ship. He counted across the outer edge of Sol, in yards and dark and quiet, holding orbits. The occupation had never thought to check, because a beaten people does not need checking 206 human hulls. 206, where Kale had reported 40 and called it the whole of the species. Neril made himself say it on the command channel, in the flat way that put it in the permanent record, 206 hulls, and he added, because it was the part that frightened him more than the number, no two of them alike. This was the thing his training had no shelf for. When the Ascendancy built a fleet, it built one ship 1,000 times, because sameness was strength. Sameness meant every part fit every ship and every crew knew every deck. The humans had not done that. Every one of the 206 was different from the last, a little larger, a little stranger, a little more like the Sethari designs, and a little less, as though each ship were a revision of the one before it. They were not manufacturing a fleet. They were iterating one. Each hull was a lesson. The previous hull had taught them welded into steel, and Neril finally understood the 40. 40 had not been humanity's navy. 40 had been humanity's rear guard, the ones slow enough to be caught at Titan. And even those 40 had cost the Ascendancy more than Kale had ever put in the record. The real fleet had never been at Titan at all. The real fleet was being written hull by hull in the week since, by a species that treated a lost battle as a first draft. It was in the middle of this, while Kale stood silent at the window, and the command deck learned a new kind of quiet, that the woman finally showed her face. Until then, the humans had spoken only through controllers, flat voices, reading corrections. Now, a single transmission came inward to the flagship addressed to Sky-Marshal Duran Kale, by name, which itself was a small horror, because it meant the humans knew exactly who had stood over Titan. Neril logged the sender, Fleet Admiral Mara Holt, Warship Providence. He had never heard the name. It was in none of the records, which he had stopped finding. Surprising, she did not threaten. That was what unmade the deck. Neril had expected fury, the high sound of a species finally answering for its dead, and there was none of it. Mara Holt spoke the way Dana Okafor counted plainly, as if reciting something already settled. She said she knew what the Ascendancy had done at Titan, and she knew what it had shown to 40 species. She said the Ascendancy had made a broadcast, and humanity had made a note, and then she gave the order back to him. She used his own words, the words he had spoken over the burning moon, the words that had gone into Neril's record as a boast. "You told us to close the record, Sky-Marshal," she said. "We didn't. We've been keeping it, all of it. Every ship you sent, every world you did this to, before ours. It's a very long record now, and it isn't closed. And soon everyone who watched your broadcast is going to read it." The channel ended. Neril sat in his alcove, with his talons still on the cold interface, and understood in a slow, sick wave that the humans had not been surviving the occupation, they had been documenting it. The stillness he had mistaken for a beaten people holding their breath had been a people taking notes, and the clock the dying man had started over Titan was not counting down to their rescue. It was counting up to this, to a debt coming due in front of the same 40 species who had been invited to watch them fall. He pulled his private files, the working heat on the dead moon, the mail full of deadlines, 3 ships gone without a scream, the station that fired with Sethari hands, 206 hulls, no 2 alike. He laid them in order, the way Dana Okafor laid her scratches on the wall, and he saw that they were not separate wrongnesses at all. They were a single sentence, being spoken very slowly, and it was almost finished. Up on the command deck, Kale gave an order. Neril wrote it into the permanent record, and even as he wrote it, he heard how hollow it had become, how the same 3 words that had been a conqueror's boast over Titan were now just a thing a frightened commander said to keep the deck from hearing his fear. "Close the record," the Sky-Marshal said. The record did not close. It never had, and out beyond the edge of Sol in a system the Ascendancy had already priced and catalogued and shown to the galaxy as a grave. A plain counter that no Sethari had ever seen was very near the top of its count. They came back on a day the occupation had marked as routine. Neril had the word in front of him when it started in the morning order. From the command deck, routine hold, routine patrol density. The occupation had been running on that word for weeks, the way a man keeps whistling in the dark, to prove the dark is empty. Then the human fleet crossed the edge of Sol, and the word died in every mouth aboard the Undimmed, and no one ever used it again. They did not come screaming. Neril would remember that the way he remembered the quiet of Titan. There was no war cry on the open bands, no wall of noise meant to frighten. There was one transmission sent to the flagship, and to every Sethari ship in the system, at once in the calm voice he had learned to dread. Fleet Admiral Mara Holt, Warship Providence. 2 words, clock's done. And Neril understood all at once the thing he had been circling for weeks. The clock had never been a countdown to rescue. Over Titan, in the last minute of the last human ship, a dying controller had started it, and it had not been measuring the time until help came. It had been measuring the time humanity gave itself to answer. The weeks of working heat on the dead moon, the mail full of deadlines, the 206 hulls written one after another, the debris of Titan taken home and read like scripture. All of it had been inside the clock, and the clock was done. Then he saw how many there were, and the number stopped being a number. Kale's fleet was strong. It was the fleet that had ended. 11 peoples arranged around the Undimmed in the perfect sameness, the Ascendancy trusted hull after identical hull. Against it, the humans brought 844 ships, and no 2 of them were alike. Neril counted them, because counting was what he was for, and every hull he counted was a revision of the one before it. He could see the lineage now, the way each was a lesson welded into steel. There were ships that carried the beam logic he had watched take apart the punishment squadron, and beside them, ships that carried something newer, an answer to an answer, as if the humans had spent the weeks not only learning how the Sethari killed, but predicting how the Sethari would adapt, and building past it, before the adaptation existed. This was the thing the War College above Kale's door had never imagined. A people is its fleet, but the humans were not a fleet. They were the thing that made fleets, and it did not stop, and it did not repeat itself, and every day it was a little worse to face than the day before. The battle, when Neril wrote, it took very few words, and that was the horror of it. It was not a slaughter. The humans did not paint the black with Sethari dead, though Neril understood watching that they took the fleet apart the way Dana Okafor had counted her people out of a burning yard with a dreadful patient care. They did not destroy the identical Sethari hulls. They disabled them. A drive killed here, a weapon spine cut there. Each ship left dark and helpless, and pointedly alive. The precision was worse than any massacre would have been, because a massacre is rage, and rage can be understood. This was arithmetic. The humans were solving the Ascendancy's fleet one term at a time, and leaving the crews inside to watch the answer come out. Kale's ships fired everything they had. Some of it even landed. The humans took hits and closed the distance and kept working. And Neril, whose whole life was the record, saw the exact moment the deck of the Undimmed stopped believing in the doctrine it had been raised on. It was not when the first Sethari ship went dark. It was later when a human vessel took a full spread from 3 Sethari hulls at once, the kind of fire that should have ended anything, and came through it, scorched and venting, and did not slow down, did not even change course, because behind it were 40 more exactly like it, and none of them were afraid. On the command deck, someone asked the question. Neril heard it come down the channel, thin from an officer whose certainty had run out. How many ships do they have? It was the oldest question. The Ascendancy knew how to ask the question that had ended 11 peoples, because to the Sethari, the answer to that question was the whole of a war. The humans answered it. Mara Holt's voice, flat on the open band, as though she had been waiting for exactly that question, because she had heard it asked of 40 species before. Enough, she said. And more tomorrow than today? That was the reveal Neril had been dreading without knowing its shape, and it was not a hidden fleet, and it was not a secret weapon, and that was why it could not be answered. There was no number to beat, because the number was not fixed. The Ascendancy could have destroyed a fleet. You cannot destroy a tomorrow. Every ship the Sethari killed was already obsolete. The ship replacing it was already better. The yard building the replacement was already 3 revisions ahead. The humans had not brought a bigger navy to Sol. They had brought a slope, and the slope only went one way. And the Sethari were standing at the bottom of it, looking up. By the end of that first day, the fleet that had ended, 11 peoples, was a field of dark and drifting hulls alive, silenced waiting. The Undimmed hung at the center of it, and Sky-Marshal Duran Kale stood at the great window where he had watched Titan burn and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left in the doctrine to say. And the human ships did not fire on his homeworld. They were in position to. Neril could see it in the plot. The road to the Sethari home stars lay open, undefended the way Titan had lain open, and the humans had 844 reasons, and one very good grievance, and 40 species were watching this band the way they had watched. The other one, everything was arranged for the answer the Ascendancy would have given. The broadcast was ready. The grave was dug. The humans held still. For a long moment, nothing happened, and the nothing was the loudest thing Neril had ever recorded. The human fleet sat in the wreckage of the Ascendancy's certainty, with a clear road to the Sethari home stars, and it did not take the road. Neril watched the plot and did not understand it, because by every law he had ever written into the permanent record, this was the moment the grave got filled. This was what the Sethari did. You beat a people, you showed the galaxy, and then you finished it, so the galaxy would remember the finishing. Kale had done it 11 times. The humans had 844 ships, and every right in the black and 40 species were watching. And the correct move, the Sethari move, was to burn the Sethari home the way Titan had been burned, and put a single line of text beneath the footage. Then Mara Holt spoke again, and Neril learned that the humans had been building towards something other than that all along. She spoke on the open band so that all 40 species heard it, and she did not raise her voice. She said the Ascendancy had made a broadcast. She said 40 peoples had watched the footage of Titan under a line that called it humanity's greatest defeat. She said humanity had watched it too, and had decided that the galaxy should see how the story actually ended, and that this was that. You called Titan our grave, she said, and you showed it to 40 species. We are standing over yours right now, and the same 40 are watching. So look at what we do next, because this is the only part that matters. And then the human fleet powered down its guns. Neril recorded it and did not believe it, and recorded it anyway. 844 ships in position to end a species stood down their weapons in front of the entire audience. The Ascendancy had gathered to witness humanity's humiliation. The humans did not fire on the home stars. They did not fire on the drifting disabled fleet. They cut the drives of the last Sethari ships, still fighting opened lanes in their own formation, and began of all things to broadcast rescue coordinates, so that the crews of the ships they had disabled could limp home alive. Mara Holt said the thing that Neril would carry for the rest of his life, the thing that went out to 40 species and could not be unsaid. You chose to kill our doctors at Titan, she said. You chose to parade the woman who ran our evacuation. We are choosing to let your crews go home to theirs. Those are not the same choice. Everyone watching remember which one of us made which. That was the mercy. And it was worse for the Ascendancy than any massacre, because a massacre would have made them martyrs, and this made them small. 40 species had been assembled to watch humanity broken. They had watched instead humanity win completely, and then decline to do the thing the Ascendancy would have done. The lesson 40 peoples took home was not that humanity was strong. Everyone was strong until they weren't. The lesson was that humanity was strong and would not do to you what the Sethari had done. And that comparison was a wound the Ascendancy would never close, because it invited every tributary world in the galaxy to weigh two masters and choose. There was one condition. Mara Holt gave it plainly, the only demand in the whole of that day, and it told Neril more about the humans than the 844 ships had. She wanted the prisoners back. The shipwrights, taken from Titan, the faces the Ascendancy had kept for the broadcast. She wanted every one of them, and she named the number. And Neril, who kept the file, knew the number was exactly right down to the last soul, which meant the humans had been counting them too. All this time, the way Dana Okafor counted her people every morning. The one thing humanity's fleet had come across the black to reclaim above the homeworld it spared, and the vengeance it set down, was its own taken people. The order to release the prisoners came down to Neril's deck, because he was the rememberer, because he held the files. He walked to the holding deck himself. He told himself, it was procedure. It was not procedure. Dana Okafor was standing when the doors opened, because of course she was standing, 38 years old, the mother of 2 children, whose ages he had never been able to stop looking at a supervisor of a yard that was supposed to be dead. There were scratches on the wall of her cell, small and patient, a count that had been climbing toward this day, without her ever being sure it would come. She had kept the others whole. Neril could see it in the way they gathered behind her, in the way she counted them one more time as they moved toward the doors, making sure the number was right before she let herself go anywhere. She looked at Neril on her way out. She did not know what he was. To her, he was one more Sethari, one of the crew that had burned her moon and taken her from her children, and hung her face before 40 species under a lie. She had every reason to say something, and she was the kind of person who would have earned the right. She only looked at him, the way she had looked at the weapons in the smoke of her yard, the way you look at bad weather that is finally passing. Then she went where the humans were, and Neril stood in the empty holding deck with the scratches on the wall, and understood that the woman he had spent weeks refusing to broadcast had never once in all of it been afraid of him. She had just been waiting for her count to finish. He went back up to the command deck. He had to. He was the rememberer, and there was a record to keep, and the record was the only thing on the Undimmed that still had any authority at all. Sky-Marshal Duran Kale was at the great window. The burned moon was long behind them. What hung in the black now was his own fleet, dark and drifting, and alive, and beyond it, the human ships opening their lanes to let the Sethari crews go home. Kale did not look like a conqueror anymore. He looked like a man who had just learned that the one science he trusted had never been a science at all, that a people as its fleet had been a comfortable lie carved over a door, and that he had built his whole life on the space beneath it. He gave an order. It was the same order he had given over Titan, the same 3 words Neril had written into the permanent record as a boast, and then watched grow hollower every time the Sky-Marshal reached for them. Close the record, but there was no one to obey it. The deck was silent. Neril stood at his alcove, with his talons on the cold interface, and did not move to close anything, because the record was not his to close, and never had been. It belonged now to the 844 ships that were writing it, and to the woman counting her people home, and to 40 species who had just watched the ending. The Ascendancy never meant them to see. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Sethari were not the ones holding the pen. The talks were held in the black between the 2 fleets, in a neutral hull the humans provided, and Neril was ordered to attend, because someone had to keep the record, and there was no longer anyone else. the deck trusted to do it. He went as what he was, a rememberer, third rank, carrying the tools of his function. He sat at the edge of the human chamber and watched his own people come to the table with the particular stiffness of the recently certain, and he watched the humans wait for them with the ease of a species that had already decided how they would go and saw no reason to perform. Mara Holt was smaller than Neril had expected. He had built her in his mind from the size of what she commanded, and the woman herself was unremarkable gray at the temples, a pen from her homeworld, clipped at her collar, that she took out and set on the table in front of her. An old worn smooth by a thumb over years, she used it to make notes by hand, while everyone spoke. That was the first thing Neril understood about the terms before a word was said. The admiral of the fleet that had unmade the Ascendancy was in the end another person who wrote things down. Sky-Marshal Duran Kyle sat across from her, and he had shrunk in a way that had nothing to do with his body. Neril had watched him over the burning moon immense with victory, and he watched him now search for the register a Sethari commander used, and find that none of them fit, because all of them assumed a fleet at his back, and his fleet was drifting dark behind him with the humans deciding whether it would ever move again. Kale tried once to speak the old way. He spoke of the strength of the Ascendancy, of 12,000 years of 40 peoples. It was the language of a man reciting the size of a fleet, and Neril heard it curdle in the room even as it left his mouth, because everyone at the table, human and Sethari, both could see the fleet. He was invoking, hanging silent in the window. Mara Holt let him finish. Then she said the thing that Neril wrote down word for word, and that he would go on writing in one form or another for the rest of his life. "You keep telling me how many ships you had," she said. "I know exactly how many you had. We counted them at Titan. And here, down to the last hull, that was never the number that mattered." She set the pen down. "The dangerous thing about humans was never a weapon, Sky-Marshal. It's that we remember exactly how you did it, and then we come back to teach it to you." The room was very quiet. "You didn't defeat us at Titan," she went on, and there was no anger in it, which was what made it land. "You handed us a syllabus. Every ship you sent, we took apart and read. Everything you did to us, and to the 11 peoples before us, we wrote down. That broadcast you made, the one you showed to 40 species. We treated it as a lesson plan. The most expensive thing your Ascendancy has ever done was to teach us in front of an audience exactly how it kills, and then leave us alive to study." Neril at the edge of the room felt the words settle into him with the weight of a thing that was simply true. He had watched it happen and had not had the sentence for it. And now the human had handed him the sentence, and he wrote it into the permanent record because that was his function, and because he could not have stopped himself if he tried. Then Mara Holt did the thing that turned the meeting from a defeat into something the Sethari would carry for generations. She reached down, and she brought up onto the table between them the record, not a human record, theirs, the Book of the Ascendancy, the great permanent archive of 12,000 years, the one Kael had ordered, closed over the burning moon, the one Neril himself had kept. The humans had it. Of course they had it. They had taken the outposts, read the mail, cracked the archive, and they had the whole of it. Every conquest, every broadcast, every face the Ascendancy had ever kept, and paraded all 40 peoples laid out in the Sethari's own careful hand. "You told us to close the record," she said. "You've been saying it for weeks. I've heard the transcripts. Every time one of your ships did something you couldn't explain, someone up your chain said, 'Close the record,' as if saying it could make a thing not have happened." She turned the archive so it faced Kale. "It was never closed. You just stopped reading it. So we're going to open it in front of the same 40 species who watched Titan, not our version, yours. Everything you did in your own words, that you thought no one would ever read back to you." And that was the payoff of the thing Neril had been listening to for weeks. The 3 hollow words that had started as a boast over Titan and grown emptier every time Kale reached for them. "The record is closed." It had never been closed. A rememberer keeps everything. That was the whole of the office. And the humans had understood the Sethari's own archive better than the Sethari had grasped that a people who wrote everything down and then declined to look at it had built the exact weapon of their own undoing and handed the key to anyone patient enough to read The Ascendancy would now be required to publish its own history, to the galaxy it had conquered in its own hand, and no line of triumphant text beneath any footage could survive it. Hale did not order the record closed again. There was no one to say it to, and the words had died in his mouth somewhere in the last hour, and Neril, watching, thought that this was what it actually looked like when an empire ended, not fire. A man discovering that the pen was in someone else's hand, and had been for longer than he knew. The terms were not what the Sethari would have written. That was the last lesson of the meeting, and the deepest. The humans did not take the Sethari home stars. They did not install a tribute. They did not take a face to parade, though they had earned 40 of them. What they demanded was almost nothing by the measure of conquest, and it was the most frightening thing they could have asked, because it was not conquest at all. They demanded that the record be opened. They demanded that the 11 peoples the Ascendancy had broken before humanity be told in the Ascendancy's own words what had been done to them, so that those who had survived could decide for themselves what came next. And they demanded that the Sethari keep the record from now on. Honestly, every entry, including this one, including the day, a species they had called a grave, stood over their home and chose to let their crews go home. They imposed remembering, not ruin. Remembering. And Neril, who had spent his life believing that the record was the thing that made the Ascendancy strong, understood at last that it had always been the thing that could make it answerable, and that the humans had simply been the first people in 12,000 years to read it that way. It was near the end, when the terms were all but set, that the other thing happened, the thing that had nothing to do with fleets, and it was the quietest moment in the room, and the one Neril would think of most. The released prisoners were being logged for their journey home. It was a formality. The humans had them, already had counted them, the moment they came aboard, the way Dana Okafor had counted them every morning of the occupation, but the count was read aloud for the record. The number of souls taken from Titan, and the number returned, and the two numbers were not the same. Neril had known they would not be. He kept the files. He had known for weeks the way he knew everything, without letting himself feel it. One of the shipwrights taken at Titan had not survived the taking. An older man, a welder whose name was in Neril's archive, along with the small facts, a rememberer collects and does not examine that he had worked the Titan yards for 30 years, that there was a permanent stain on his bench from a marker he had used and never cleaned, that he had a daughter. The number was red, and the discrepancy was read, flatly the way the humans read everything. And Mara Holt, who had not once raised her voice, who had spared a homeworld without a flicker, stopped writing for a moment. She picked her old pen back up, and she made a single mark on her page, and Neril, close enough to see, understood that she was not recording a casualty figure. She was writing a name, one name by hand, the way you write the name of a person, and not the sum of a loss. Then she set the pen down and went on with the terms, and no one in the room said anything, because there was nothing to say that would be equal to it, and the humans knew better than to try. That was the difference, and it was the whole difference, and it was the thing. 40 species would spend a generation turning over. The Ascendancy had kept a face to parade. Humanity kept a name to grieve. Both peoples wrote everything down. Only one of them had ever understood what the writing was for. When the meeting broke, Neril sat alone in the human chamber for a moment before he was called back to the undimmed, and he opened the book of the Ascendancy, the great record he had served all his life, to the page that was his to keep. It was time to enter the day. For 12,000 years, the numbers, a rememberer, wrote on that page, had been the numbers of the dead. Enemy hulls destroyed. Cities taken, peoples ended. That was what the record was. That was what victory looked like in the Sethari's own hand. Neril looked at the empty line, and for the first time in the history of his office, the number he had to write was not a number of the dead. It was a number of the living 844 ships that had stood over a homeworld and set their guns down. A count of shipwrights returned to their children, less one whose name a human had written by hand. A record opened that would not be closed. He wrote it. His talons were steady this time. And somewhere below him on a moon, the galaxy had been told was a grave. The working heat was still bleeding off the deep gantries, because the yards had never stopped, and the clock, having finished its first count, had quietly begun another. Dana Okafor came home on an ordinary transport, on an ordinary morning, and no one made a broadcast of it. Neril knew the details, because he still kept the files. It had become a strange habit in the weeks after the talks reading the human record, instead of his own. The way a man who has lost his religion will go on reading the book out of an ache he cannot name. The humans, it turned out, wrote everything down too, but they wrote different things. Where the Sethari record would have logged a returned prisoner as a recovered asset, the human record noted that the transport was met at the yard by 2 children ages that Neril had never been able to stop looking at, and that the younger one had grown enough in the months of the occupation that his mother did not for one whole second recognize him, and then did. That was the entire entry. The humans did not editorialize. They simply thought it was worth writing down that a boy had grown and that his mother had known him. After all, the yards of Titan were working again. They had in truth never stopped. The working heat Neril had flagged on a dead moon and been told was a scavenger fire had been the yards all along, running in the dark, under the nose of an occupation that had priced them for demolition. Now they ran in the open. Dana Okafor went back to them because that was what she did, because a woman who counts her people out of a burning building is not a woman who sits still afterward. She took up her old bench, and here the human record noted a small thing, the kind of thing the Sethari would never have logged in 12,000 years, because it was not a conquest or a casualty or a hull. There was a stain on one of the benches in the Titan yard, a permanent mark from a marker. An old welder had used for 30 years and never cleaned the welder whose name Mara Holt had written by hand at the talks, the one soul. The count came back short. The new crews could have sanded the bench down. They did not. They worked around the mark. Dana Okafor, the human record said, kept her tools on that bench and no other. And when a young worker asked her once why she did not take a cleaner station, she told him that a yard should remember its people, and left it there. Neril read that alone in his alcove, and closed the file and sat for a long time with nothing to write. He had spent his life certain of a single thing, the thing carved over the door of the War College, where Kyle had trained. A people is its fleet. Break the fleet, and you break the people. It was the whole science of the Ascendancy, 12,000 years of it, and it had been true 40 times, and it had been a lie the entire time. And no one had noticed, because no one had ever survived long enough to teach the Sethari. Otherwise, the humans had survived. The humans had taken the worst day of their history, the day the galaxy was invited to watch them die, and they had treated it as a first draft. They had not been a fleet at all. They had been the thing that makes fleets and mends them, and the ordinary stubborn people who go back to a bench with a dead man's mark on it and pick the work back up. You cannot break that by burning a moon. You can only teach it how you burn moons, and then hope it never comes back to show you what it learned. Empires do not fall the way trees fall. Neril would think this often in the years after, and it was as close as he ever came to understanding what he had watched. A tree falls all at once, with a sound in a direction you can see. Empires fall the way the tide goes out so slowly that on any given day you can tell yourself the water is only resting, that it will come back, that the record is closed, and the thing is done. It goes quietly, and then one morning you look up, and the ships that ended, 11 peoples, are drifting dark in the black, alive spared, and 40 species, who once watched you conquer, are reading your own history back to you in your own hand. And there was never a single moment you could point to and say there that was. When we lost, you lost in all of them. You lost every day. You said the word routine into the dark, to prove the dark was empty. The book of the Ascendancy stayed open. That was the term the humans had imposed, the only real one, and it turned out to be the heaviest thing they could have asked. The Sethari were made to keep their record honestly. Now every entry, and the 11 peoples they had broken before humanity were told in the Ascendancy's own words what had been done to them. Some of those peoples were still deciding what to do with the knowing. The Sethari would be answering for it for a long time, not in fire. In the slow accounting of a galaxy that had been shown on the same 40 channels, 2 ways of being strong, and had been left to choose between them. Neril remained a rememberer, There was still a record to keep, and he found to his own surprise that he wanted to keep it more honestly than he ever had. He had learned the difference between the two archives the hard way, on a burning moon, and in a quiet chamber in the black. The Sethari had kept a face to parade. The humans had kept a name to grieve. Both peoples wrote everything down. Only one of them had ever known why. On the moon called Titan, the clock that a dying man had started in the last minute of the last human ship had finished its first count long ago, on the day the fleet came home, and Mara Holt said the two words that ended the occupation. But a clock once started is not a thing that stops. The humans had set it running again, the way they set everything running again without ceremony, because there was more to build, and there was always going to be more to build. It was not counting down to anything now. It was just the yards keeping time. The last thing in the human record, the last entry, Neril let himself read before he finally closed the file for good, was not about the fleet, or the talks, or the ascendancy, or him. It was about a boy, Dana Okafor's younger son, the one who had grown so much in the occupation that his mother had not known him for a second. He had spent those months while she was a face in an enemy's broadcast, and a count of scratches on a cell wall building something, a model of a ship. The record said out of scrap from the yard, the way children of shipwrights do. He had finished it, the week she came home. It was not a warship. He had built the transport that brought her back. And that was where the humans ended their record of the war, that the galaxy had been told was humanity's greatest defeat. Not with a fleet, not with a number, with a woman at a bench that remembered its dead, and a cup of coffee going cold beside a small ship built out of scrap by a boy who had wanted more than anything to bring his mother home. Neril closed the file. Then he opened his own, the great permanent record of the Ascendancy, to the page that was his to keep, and he began honestly to write it down.